In December 1941, a high-level discussions occurred in the Japanese army about the feasibility of invading Australia. As the aggressive enemy marched on southward through Asia, real fear began to emerge in our country that indeed might happen. On the 14th of February 1942, that's a day before the fall of Singapore, high-ranking Japanese army and naval officers again talked about overrunning our country from the north. In the same month in Australia, a secret and controversial defence proposal emerged. It was called the Brisbane Line. The idea was that we will concede the northern portion of our continent and we will seek to hold our own south of the Brisbane Line. That proposal was actually rejected by the then PM and his war cabinet. But meanwhile, a propaganda poster emerged in that same year alerting Australians to the idea of Japanese invading. You can find that poster on the internet if you want to do a search, and you'll see it. There's a map of Australia. Behind it there's a flag of Japan, and there's a Japanese soldier, just one, with his rifle and 1 foot coming over and about to land on the map of Australia. And the words were on that propaganda poster: "He's coming south. It's fight, work, or perish." What was the fear? Well, the enemy was aggressive. They had been breathtakingly successful. They seemed so strong. We were weak and very vulnerable. Their troops were advancing south while most of our soldiers were in Europe or northern Africa. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, and there seemed to be so many of them that they just kept coming. And so the cry went out from our country, from our leadership: we need help. If we are to avoid invasion, we need help, especially if we could launch an offensive attack and drive the enemy back. And so the Australian Prime Minister appealed to the United States for help. We know that. In 1942, large numbers of US troops arrived on our shores, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy would retreat and a song of victory would be heard in our streets. With such powerful might on our side, the enemy would be scattered. There was hope. And friends, in many ways that, I believe, describes the plight of the Christian church in this world. The church militant, as it's sometimes called. Our enemy is powerful. He appears to be overrunning our former territory. Of course, we don't just have one enemy as Christians, but many. The world, the flesh, and the devil. And sometimes our biggest enemy as Christians is within. Unbelief is an enemy, even in our hearts as Christians. And yet the opposition to the church, the opposition to my Christian faith and daily walk is so strong, and I'm sure you can identify with that sense. In light of that strength, I feel so weak. The advance seems unstoppable. The enemy is aggressive. And it appears today that the enemy is advancing in unstoppable success. Well, with our eyes on the enemy and all the opposition, we could quickly be overcome with fear and defeat. And we can retreat into our bunkers, and we can try our best to hold our own as we wait for life to pass or Jesus to return. That is not how God would have us live as Christians. That is not how the Lord has ever directed His people to live in this world. In a hostile world with an aggressive enemy, where do we turn? If we would ever see the enemy pushed back in retreat, if we would ever see in our country Christ's cause advance in our day, in our nation, in this district, in our families, and even in each of our lives and hearts, I believe we need to embrace this victorious perspective we read of in Psalm 68, when David says, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered." If you notice at the top of that psalm, it says it's a song. It's a song by David. And it's a song that has much help for us today as Christians and as a church, as we face many enemies in our world, as much help for us as it was a help for David and the people of God in his day with their enemies in their world. And so, friends, I want us to consider this together this morning. I've called this a song of victory because it's a song and it's got this theme of victory through it. And I'd like us to think about it under three headings. There's three things here. Number one, a triumphant exclamation. Number two, a subsequent examination. And then number three, a jubilant anticipation. Let's go back and look again at our Bibles. There at verse 1, we see a triumphant exclamation. What's the exclamation? Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, let those also who hate him flee before him. That's the theme, if you like, of this song of victory by David. This is a song that God wants us to constantly be singing. This is, if you like, to be the melody that all of God's people should sing in every generation, in David's generation and in our generation. These notes of this song are not to fade out. This is to be the enduring sympathy of symphony of victory for Christ's church on earth. Whatever is the opposition that comes, and it does come, no matter how strong the enemy appears or how weak we might feel, this is the triumphant exclamation we can sing. This is the tune that we must be plucking on the harp of our hearts constantly. Let God arise. Let his enemies be scattered. Singing this, friends, not just on Sundays when we're feeling safe with other Christians, not just on Sundays when we're feeling strong in the things of God and enthused, but singing this song on Mondays when we're feeling weak and we're feeling vulnerable and we're feeling all alone. Eyes not on the strong enemy, but firmly fixed on our God. Now, when we analyse something of the nature of the words and the expression here that's being conveyed, I think it's a wonderful expression, because what David is saying, it seems to be what so often it looks like. What's he say? Those first three words. Let God arise. Arise. You see, it often appears to us as humans as if God is resting somewhere, that he's inactive. We look at circumstance and they all seem to add up perhaps to the conclusion in our human and limited estimation that God's not doing anything, that he's somehow asleep. His enemies do what they want. They're so strong, they're so aggressive. Well, God and his cause appears weak. It appears defeated. It appears that it's lying down and it's about to be trampled on. However, the reality is, according to the Scriptures, God never sleeps nor slumbers, the psalm says. God's always working. And yet there is a sense in which there are times when it is like as if God does arise and he comes and he moves in greater power than it appears that he does at other times. And David wants God's people to be singing this song of triumphant exclamation. And what David does now is he's highlighting for us that there are things in our lives that are struggles for us. That's what he's expressing straight away. Can you identify with that, Christian friend? Do you have struggles today? What are the fears that you have that have invaded your heart, that was once a heart of faith but now seems to be more of a heart of fear? What temptations are you facing that seem to be so strong for you? Too strong. What are those hopes that you once had but now seem so faint? Well, here is your song to sing. The Christian church is not to march through this world with a sense of defeat. God has given us this song of victory to help us to recognize that we are not defeated. That we have a great God, a mighty God, and we can have complete confidence in Him and what He can do. Now, David didn't invent these words. David is actually giving to us an ancient victory cry that had been around in the nation of Israel for about 500 years. David lived 500 years roughly after Moses. And see, this phrase first surfaced when Moses and the people moved camp for the first time from around the bottom of Mount Sinai, as we read about it in Numbers chapter 10, and they moved out toward their beginning of their journey. God directed them, remember, through the pillar of cloud. God was on the move. And when He moves to action, none can withstand His might, no matter how strong the enemy might appear or the opposition seems to us. In verse 2, David illustrates this ancient victory cry, this dominating power of God. He illustrates what has happened since the days of Moses up until his day. How God has been arising and all the enemies have been fleeing before Him. He illustrates that by two different illustrations in verse 2. Look at the first one. He says, as. So this is like this. He says, as smoke is driven away, so drive them away. It's an illustration that everybody can relate to. The children understand this. How easily wind blows smoke away. That smoke, when the wind comes, is completely removed from near the fire. No trace is left when the strong wind blows of where that smoke once was. It may be a raging fire. There may be tons of billowing smoke that are going up into the sky above that fire. But when the wind comes, none of that smoke can stand there and say to the wind, no, go away, wind. The smoke cannot do that. It's powerless to remain in that place. When the wind comes, the smoke is blown away. He says, so too, no enemy, no matter how strong, can resist or defy God. And so the enemy's godless smoke, the godless of this earth, their smoke might sting the eyes of the righteous. Their foul odour might be gross to us when we smell the fumes of their sin. They might fume with pride. They might darken the sky with their deeds. They might mount higher and higher in their arrogant plans and schemes against God and His church and Christ and His ways. They might defile whatever they would seek to prevail, where they would prevail. One breath from heaven, when by God's mighty Spirit He comes, they're blown away. The second illustration, the second half of verse 2, he says, as. Now it's like this, he says, as wax melts before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. Now wax itself might be hard, but in the fire, near the fire, how soft wax becomes. The hardest heart will melt in God's fiery hand. A candle might seem so impressive. It may look strong because it's big. It may stand there erect. It may even have a sense, wow, that's a magnificent, majestic candle. But one little flame will melt it down. You see, the arrogant pride of the toughest enemy will melt in God's presence. And here David says, this is why we as God's people can sing this triumphant exclamation. If God would arise, the smoke and the wax. If God would arise, the enemies, those who hate God, will be blown away. Here's why we can march through this world as Christians with a sense, not of defeat, but of victory. Because this is our God. He is eternal. He never changes. Whether it's David's day, whether it's Moses' day, whether it's Jesus' day, whether it's the Apostles' day, whether it's the Reformers' day, whether it's our day, He stays the same. And so, what is to be our attitude? He tells us in verses 3 and 4. But let the righteous be glad. Let them rejoice before God. Yet let them rejoice exceedingly. Sing to God. Sing praises to His name. Extol Him who rides on the clouds. By His name Yah. That's an abbreviation of Yahweh. And rejoice before Him. You see, the righteous ones, God's people, they know their God. We who were ourselves once His enemies, but now by His grace have been made right with Him. We can rejoice. We can live our lives with confidence in Him, even in the midst of the real life, death, struggles that we pass through in this broken world. God's cause, friends, will never fail. Therefore, His people can rejoice even in the heat of the battle, when everything seems to add up to our human calculation and it seems to suggest that we're about to be overrun by the enemy. Let God arise. His enemies will be scattered. Friends, the world can't see this. But our God is on the march. And no one can withstand Him or resist Him in His sovereign power. That's our God. And therefore we can rejoice exceedingly, as David says, in Him. And so here is this opening exhortation. It's this triumphant exclamation. Secondly, think with me now as what David goes on to do in what I'm calling a subsequent examination. Of course, the skeptics could stand up in light of this sort of thing that we've been looking at and say, well, isn't this just like a 1940s propaganda poster? Isn't this just a big beat up? Stirring up support? Isn't all this is? Isn't this just David, like a very clever spin doctor? He's like a modern politician. He's good with words. He's got media savvy. Does, perhaps, you might think, seem almost some sort of like a modern day political speech to the faithful. The sort of thing we hear in a political campaign trying to persuade us that things are better than they seem. We just need to be positive. We just need positive leadership. That's all we need. We just need a positive outlook. We just need greater confidence in the marketplace of the church. Well, is David really just a good politician with political rhetoric? Is this just a bold claim that is not backed up with facts and figures? No, it's not that. This is not a hollow exclamation. This is a truthful, triumphant exclamation. And what David does now in his subsequent examination from that first part is he's actually going to very briefly scan the history of God's dealings with his people from Moses up until this time. You see, David backs up his opening claims with facts. And the first thought David races to is Israel's wilderness years. In verse 4, we read it before, he speaks of God riding on the clouds. God leading his people through the wilderness via the cloud. Look at verse 7. He says, "O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness." God was marching. God arose in the wilderness, and his enemies were scattered. You think about it, to get into the wilderness in the first place, the enemy of Pharaoh and Egypt were defeated by 10 plagues. God arose, and Pharaoh's hard, wax heart melted. At the Red Sea, remember the story. The Egyptian army behind them, the Red Sea in front of them. And there's Israel. What are they to do? Moses cries out. And what happened? God arose. And the way appeared forward. God led them. They get to the other side of that sea. And even there, remember the scene, the mighty Egyptian army, the powerhouse of that generation, with all their intimidating chariots and their horses and their countless troops. Where were they seen by the people on the other side? They were seen washed up dead on the edge of the shore. The scriptures are clear. It says all the Egyptian soldiers died. The Egyptian enemy was scattered dead on the shore. See, David scans the history and he's showing that this is fact. He scans the history more, a subsequent examination into the conquering of the land. We jump ahead, verse 12. He says, kings of armies flee. They flee. And she who remains at home, the wife, the missus who hasn't gone out to war, she's back at home. What's she doing? She remains at home. She divides the spoil because her husband's in the army conquering the land. You recall the first city over the border, Jericho. It's a graphic scene, isn't it? Peculiar battle. God told Joshua what to do. And when God arose, even the walls were scattered. They come crashing down. Time after time, under Joshua, the enemies flee and are scattered. Let's look at one passage back in Joshua chapter 10. Just come back with me to one. Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10 and verse 9. We'll pick up the story part way through, but you'll get the sense of it as we read. Joshua chapter 10 and verse 9. Joshua therefore came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. So the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth Haron, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened, as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones, and the children of Israel killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And so the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenged upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of the heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp of Gilgal. One small section of the book of Joshua, where over and over and over again we see the outworking of David's words back in Psalm 68, when God arose. Those most powerful of all enemies that seemed that they could never defeat, those walls that they could never penetrate. When God arose, the enemies scattered. Back here in Psalm 68, verse 14, we read, when the Almighty scattered kings in it, it was white as snow in Salmon. God is the one, he says, who's scattering kings. And their armies are leaving a trail of whiteness. It's probably a reference to they're leaving a trail of bleached bones. It's the remains of the soldiers. And so when it was looked at later, it was like snow in the dark forest that covers Mount Salmon. You get the picture? It's the picture of the conquering, victorious God marching through the land. He's on the march. And then what does David do? He traces God coming from conquest of the land to occupying Zion, the mount at Jerusalem, from verse 15 and so on. He speaks about that, and here again is God who marches in victory. He leads his people follow him. And now where are they? They are settled in the land. The king in Israel is on the throne. He's victorious over his enemies. And so as a victorious king who goes out to battle, he wins those battles. What does he bring home? He brings his captives home with him that he has won in war. He also brings with him many gifts, the spoils of warfare. The king is coming back home, the general of the army. He's laden down, his victorious hands are laden down with all of this spoil, these gifts. Look at verse 18. You have ascended on high. You have led captivity captive. You have received gifts among men, even from the rebellious, that the Lord God might dwell there. God was marching through the land. The enemy, you see, was forced to retreat when God arose. God marches in victory. He's pushing back the borders, as it were. The kingdom of God is advancing, which means the kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of darkness, has to retreat. The king goes back home after that battle in those days. He's ascended the mountain where he now sits. He's laden with gifts. He's going to share them with his people. This is the very passage that the Apostle Paul quotes from in Ephesians chapter 4, when he describes the triumphant resurrected Jesus Christ returning to his heavenly Zion home. And from there in heaven, he gives gifts to his people, some even as pastors in his church today, friends. It's a picture of the victorious Christ marching on today. Unstoppable in his care for his church in our generation, even as we have been witnessing with our very eyes this morning here. All the enemies of God. Think about it this way, Christian friends, members of this church. The enemies of God have been powerless to stop what Jesus Christ has done in giving a gift to this church. Powerless. What should be our response? Back to the first part of the chapter. We should be rejoicing with exceeding gladness. Let God arise. His enemies are powerless. Jesus, he has risen, hasn't he? Literally, he rose from the dead. When he rose from the dead, he was displaying that he had defeated his enemy, Satan, sin, and death. And on this Lord's Day, on every first day of the week, we remember that God has risen and every one of his enemies one day will be scattered. And each Lord's Day between now and then is a day of victory. And in our Lord Jesus' triumphant procession back to his heavenly home, still now in this generation, he is showering on his church his gifts. He equips his little flocks with shepherds. That is an evidence that he is marching through the land in our day, friends. Yes, we may appear as a little church hopelessly outnumbered. We may look like we are weak compared to the world and we don't have media savvy. We look pathetic even compared to the world. A fearful little flock may appear defeated and a failure. But there in heaven is our risen Lord. Let God arise. His enemies will be scattered. Now, my Christian friends, can you see what David is doing through this psalm here? He is teaching us what we should do as individuals. Each of us as individual Christians should be stopping and having our own subsequent examination of our own history. Thinking back over our own Christian experience to those many times when God has defeated our enemies. Things that once held us in their grip. Fears that bound us. Sins that hindered us. But God arose. And those enemies now are scattered. You think back, Christian friend. You recall those times, and perhaps there are things that immediately come to your mind that you don't often think about. I'm sure they're there. He hasn't changed from those previous times of victory. He is still the same. Ever since you walked with him in faith, he has displayed his gracious power to you daily. We don't often see it, but it's daily. Look at verse 19. Look at verse 19. It tells us that. Blessed be the Lord, who daily gives us a trickle. One here and one there. No. Blessed be the Lord, who daily loads us with benefits. The God of our salvation. When you were in some former situation, whatever it was for you, and you had no idea how it would change, you were maybe in some bind, and it seemed as certain as death. Look at verse 20. Our God is the God of salvation, and to God the Lord belong escapes from death. As married couples in a bind, persistent problems, as Christian families, think back to those former times of victory in the Lord. When we have prayed for things, or those times when we didn't know where the answer to that problem would come from, or how we could handle that next challenge, God marvelously opened the way, didn't he? How God arose as a church. How many wonderful answers to prayer have we seen in the short history of our congregation? Certainly the ones that pop into my mind in more recent years. specific prayer requests in this room, in our prayer meeting, about RI, oppositions. And we prayed about it. God arose, and it was done. It was scattered. It was overcome. How we need to practice this very thing that David does here in this song of victory, a subsequent examination. You see, when we do, we start to see how many times have you not proven your God, my Christian friend. See, you know this is true in your experience. You know it is. If you're really a Christian, you know it is. If you're not, you don't have a clue what I'm talking about. But you know that God has arisen in your situation in the past. And whatever those enemies were, whatever those binds were, you know that He has given you the grace to see them overcome. It doesn't mean they're always solved as you might like them to. But He's overcome. You see, if in no other area, you and I, who are Christians, were once enemies of God. We were doomed to certain and eternal destruction. Justly so. And if God hadn't arisen with healing in His wings, we would have never been able to make ourselves right with God. If He hadn't sought me in my blindness, I would never have been able to find my way to Him because I was blind. We who were born again, God arose in our hearts. His love melted our natural hardened hearts to Him. His Spirit blew all that fuming pride, our arrogant plans, it blew it away like smoke that was mounting higher and higher. The smoke of our sin that actually stung our own eyes, and it stung others around us, and the foul odour of our sin spread to those others around us, and yet God graciously, powerfully blew our way. And by His regenerating Spirit, and He renewed us in His Son. He arose. He came to us. And He even scattered the enmity of our own hearts toward Him. And that's why I think we can take on verse 32 and following. Sing to the Lord, not just Israel, you kingdoms of the earth, even Aussies. Oh, sing praises to the Lord. To Him who rides on the heaven of heavens, which were of old. Indeed, He sends out His voice, a mighty voice. Ascribe strength to God. His excellence is over Israel, and His strength is in the clouds. O God, you are more awesome than your holy places. The God of Israel is He who gives strength and power to His people. What's His conclusion? Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Yes, we are blessed, but blessed be God. Thirdly and finally, friends, think with me of a jubilant anticipation. We know as Christians, we are not yet at home in heaven. Here, as we live on this earth, we are in enemy territory. The question is, how are we living as Christians in enemy territory? Are we living defeated, fearful, or are we rejoicing in our God? Do we have confidence in our God? Or are we retreating into our bunkers due to the so many enemies that are out there in our generation? We've got to hold our own. Put up the shutters. Draw the line. Fear. We're in the bunker. We draw our own Brisbane line. Walloon line. Here. No more. I think as Christians, unbelief is one of our biggest enemies. Yes, the enemy seems so strong, so large, and we struggle in the area of trusting in our God, don't we? Doubts flood into our souls and fear cripples our faith. The enemy of doubt rises to conquer us. And where do we go? We go to the bunker in a rush of anxiety and fear. We feel safe there. Is this not a struggle you have as a Christian lady? Maybe as a mum with growing children. And you're tempted to wrap up your son or your daughter in cotton wool. You want to protect them from all the dangers out there. So many potholes in the road of life. Enemies everywhere to their soul. As a mother, you naturally want to protect your boy or girl. And fear can reign in your heart. It's not just mums. Fear can reign in Dad's heart too. Rather than King Jesus, it's fear. And the answer is not our schemes, midnight thoughts, manipulative plans. God is our hope. Let God arise. His enemies, they will be scattered. Let God arise. That'll do it. Manipulative plans most often have terrible consequences. Read the patriarchs. Maybe as a Christian, you've been really battling a persistent temptation. And in your strength, you are too weak. You know your heart. You know that's the case. The enemy of that temptation seems to have the upper hand on you. You're tempted to click on that mouse where you know you shouldn't go. You're tempted to speak how you know you mustn't speak. To think thoughts that you know you ought not to think. Secret, besetting, personal sins mount up against us like an aggressive enemy heading south to invade us. My Christian friend, what is that temptation to God? In His strength, you can defeat the biggest temptation. Remember who wrote this song? David. What was the giant Goliath to David when he came to Goliath in Jehovah's name and His strength? Down he came, off with his head. And the powerful Philistines were seen fleeing to the hills. Let God arise, and the biggest, strongest enemy or temptation will be scattered. Absolutely guaranteed. We think of our evangelism as individuals, as a local church. So few seem interested. There's just so much apathy and complacency out there in our society. And we know what they will say, so why bother? Let's just bunker down for the ride and wait till our time on earth is over. There's no point today. Yes, it might be true. There may not be as many conversions in our land today as formerly, or as in Asia today, or in Africa today. But my friends, if God would arise in our land, in our district, in our sphere of influence, every enemy will be scattered. That's the hope of evangelism. It's not some new technique or some new package or some new program. It's God who's the hope of missions. And here in this passage of the Bible, we see God's track record. We see how God works. And He's calling us to cry out to Him, "Oh God, that in our day You would arise." Without this perspective, we might as well pack up, go home, and just wait for our funeral. As a church, what hope do we have with the issue of property? I mean, really, let's be realistic. Sinking our roots down in this community and establishing a base of operations for God's kingdom into the next generation and beyond? Where's the hope for that? It's in this passage. You say, but where will we find the property? How will we get all that stuff passed through council bylaws? And what about the money? And where will that come from? It's too much. It's too hard for us. Let God arise. All the opposition will be scattered. You say, Pastor, you sometimes talk about training men, planning churches and sending out missionaries. That doesn't seem very realistic for us. We're such a small church with so few resources. You know the answer. Let God arise. Talk about new ministries, but who and how and where and when? It's all too hard. Yes, friends, we must pray. We do pray. We have been praying and we will pray. But sometimes prayer can be used as an excuse for retreat to the safety of our bunker. We've seen in this passage that God was the one who was conquering the land back in Joshua's day. But for God to conquer the land in Joshua's day, he called for Joshua and the men to get their spears and their shields and their arrows and all that they needed, and that those men actually had to cross the border and they actually had to go in and fight. Now God was the one leading. The commander of the army in chief, remember, he comes to Joshua at the start. God was the one leading. And they had to rely on him, and when they didn't, they failed. But they didn't sit back on the other side of the border and just pray and wait for God to do it. They got on their war gear and they got into action. Friends, Psalm 68, I hope you can see it's a wonderful part of the Bible. It's a song of victory. It's not just about the past for Israel. It's not even just about the past for us. It's a victory anthem as we march forward as a church, following the triumphant trail of our Captain Jesus. Because if he arises, we need to be in his trail. We need to be following him and watching his enemies scatter, even into our future. As we close, I want to address those of you who are not saved, because all that I've said basically has been for Christians. Those of you here this morning who are not Christians, you're not yet saved. Jesus Christ, he's in heaven right now. He's seated at his Father's right-hand side. But he's not going to stay there forever. There's a day coming when he will arise one more time and he will return to this earth. And on that day when he arises, he will come in judgment. And on that day, every one of his enemies will be scattered and banished into hell forever in judgment, including you, if you are not right with him. And so I plead with you, be reconciled with God. He is coming. He will arise from that throne. And all of his enemies on that day will be banished. They'll be blown away. They'll be in hell. We're all born into this world as enemies of God. None of us gets in the easy way, like some back door, because we were born into a Christian family. We've always gone to church. Being religious doesn't change our hearts. Religion's all about outside stuff, externals. That's why you need God to give you a new heart, to remove your heart of stone that dark and sinful heart. That's why Jesus says you must be born again, otherwise you will never see the kingdom of heaven. Leave your sin, my friend. Leave your religion if that's what you've got to leave. Leave your rebellion and submit your heart to Christ. Ask Him to save you today before it's too late. No one knows the day of his funeral or her funeral. And no one knows the day when Jesus will come back again. Who knows? Maybe right now in heaven, Jesus is beginning to shuffle in His seat because He's about to stand on His feet and come in the clouds. Seek Him, my friend, while you can. Call upon Him. He'll hear. Ask Him to save you. And He will. My Christian friends, may we plead with God in renewed ways today when we pray soon. That God might arise in our midst and save sinners who have been invited to come tonight to our gospel service. Or that we, in prayer, in light of this passage, and I say this with a right sense, I hope you understand, with a right sense, with these words, taking them to God and storming the gates of heaven, pleading with Him that He would arise in our day, in our hearts, in our church, in our family, in this district, even tonight. That He may do new things amongst us into our future. That He may help us change our negative, defeated, fearful perspective and get us out of the bunker and get us onto our knees and ready with our swords, the sword of the Spirit, that we may follow when He leads us as He marches through the land. May God be pleased to bless His word to our hearts today.